All right, so we discussed in class the nervous system and how this explains how the brain connects to the whole body. So our most brief summary is how the nervous system is made of the brain and all the feels. This means the emotional feels and the actual feeling that we have in our fingers and toes. Key vocab that I had you write down in class was brain, spinal cord, nerves, which make up the central nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system. I do like to point out that these are just two of other nervous systems that are a part of the overall branch of nervous systems that we're going to discuss in class. Nerve cells are just like any other animal cells with all the same basic parts, with some specialized subsystems that will facilitate the passing of electrical signals. Two parts of the nerve cells I would like you to learn are the dendrites and the myelin sheath. Synapses is the last part of the cell that will help explain our essential question. Again, how does the brain connect to the whole body and all of the trillion cells that make up that whole body? So this is our George. When I say George, I just mean our random drawing that we do to show the part of the body where this system is located. So make sure with George in your notes that you sketch a brain and you draw down to make our spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord we have nerves going throughout the body here. Okay, it does not have to be a detailed sketch of this particular image. I did explain in class, it is just a sketch showing how the nervous system goes throughout the body. That is the part that you have to understand. The nervous system is not located just around here or just around here, but all throughout George's body here. Okay, these words here you do not need to write down. I'm not telling you you can't write them down, you just don't need to. We are not going to discuss the peripheral nervous system. Okay, your next sketch will involve a sketch of the brain. Your brain sketch could be something like this. It could be a weird potato shape. It could be a perfect circle. I don't care what your brain looks like. What I do care about, though, is that you're able to divide the four main lobes of the brain. So here in the front, where our forehead is located, is our frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is where all of our conscious thought occurs. And then towards the back, you have a smaller lobe we call the occipital lobe. This is where our brain processes visual information. And here at the bottom, this would be right next to our ears, is the temporal lobe. This is where auditory information is decoded, essentially. And the parietal lobe is where the brain sorts all of the sensory information it receives. So everything behind the frontal lobe here, you do not have direct control of. The only thing that you control comes from your frontal lobe, right here behind your forehead. You can't control what you hear. You can't control what you see. And you can't control what you feel. Once those sensations have entered your body, you cannot unsee, untaste, or unhear that information. The cerebellum and the brainstem, you do not need to label these parts. What we're going to refer to these are as is the hindbrain, as in behind, HINDBRAIN. The hindbrain is what connects the brain to the spinal cord. Okay, this is on the right here. We have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. So both sides have all four of these lobes. So your right hemisphere has a frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. And so does your left hemisphere. Your brain can function, if it had to, with just one hemisphere, although I would not recommend it. The next thing I need you to sketch is the nerve cell. So just like any animal cell, a nerve cell does have a nucleus. It does have a cell membrane. Okay, cytoplasm, mitochondria. We don't need to be that detailed. What I want you to focus on here is you need to have a cell body, and that cell body will connect to these dendrites here. Dendrites are one of two things I'm going to ask you to try and remember from a nerve cell. And a nerve cell is the only specialized type of cell I'm going to teach you at all. Every body system has its own set of specialized cells. Muscle system has muscle cells. Circulatory system has special circulatory cells like red blood cells, white blood cells, and they all do their own special thing and have their own look. But my personal favorite is the nerve cell, mostly because it connects to our first 9 weeks of learning. The nerve cell is a special cell that will transmit bioelectric signals. So electricity will come in through the dendrites and flow through this axon here and then exit through the axon terminals. The myelin sheath here will protect any surrounding cells from accidentally receiving those electrical impulses. You do not want accidental electric impulses going through your body. That will greatly decrease your motor function. And many degenerative diseases of the brain and nervous system involve the degradation or the, let's say, dying off or reduced function of the myelin sheath. Without this myelin sheath, your body is not going to be able to effectively control what brain signals get to where. And it needs perfect control to function optimally. So if you ever see the word neuron, it's also a nerve cell. Those terms are synonymous, which means they mean the same thing. Neuron is spelled Neuron. And in your image, I don't need you to label cell body or axon terminals. The only two that we're going to focus on, again, are our dendrites and our myelin sheath, which was located along this axon here. For all intents and purposes, we will refer to this axon as kind of like a wire that allows that electricity to flow. So I need you to have a definition for the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is a fatty tissue that surrounds the nerve cell. The myelin sheath helps control nerve impulses like an insulator around wire. This comparison, so if you remember, insulators would be plastics, rubber, things that do not effectively conduct the flow of electricity. That axon, or that wire in the middle, will allow the flow of those electric impulses. But anyway, moving on. Dendrite. Let's refer to this as the control center of the nerve cell for receiving signals. So our dendrite, if we were to continue that wire analogy, at the end of a wire, let's say to any of your devices, you need to plug it in somewhere to get that electric impulse to go through it. So that's what the dendrite is. It's the plug-in, the prongs at the end of the wire that we would plug into the wall to make sure that it receives the signals of where it's supposed to go. If you'll notice, just going back, it has all of these spindles, and then the axon terminals, these things here at the bottom, it also has a bunch of spindles. It will connect inside of these dendrite receptors. Alright, so we've talked about the structure of a nerve cell. Now let's talk about the function. What does the nerve cell do? So here in this image, you can see the end of the nerve cell connecting to a muscle fiber or muscle cells. Muscle cells, again, are specialized, and they make up these fibrous kind of links, like long strings. Those electric impulses will pass through the nerve cell into other cells to control all body functions. So, from your brain, your frontal lobe, you decide to move your arm. It goes through your brainstem into your spinal cord, through your peripheral nervous system, or just the nerves, what we're going to just call the nerves, into your arm, and those signals then will either contract, tighten the muscle. You can even feel your bicep tightening when you lift your arm up, and you can relax your arm, and you can even feel your bicep relaxing. So that signal comes from your frontal lobe. You have decided to move that muscle. So one of the ways that the nervous system is able to function so quickly, you're able to just, there's milliseconds of time. It's almost imperceptible where you decide to do something and your body does it. And how it does that is with these synapses, or one of the ways that it does it. It's a space in between nerve cells where the electric impulses jump. So the comparison here is like a Van de Graaff generator. If you remember our static electricity maker that we had at the beginning of the 9 weeks, if you stuck your finger close to it, you would get a little electric shock. That jump would help create, or it would be the starting point and end point of electrons. So from positive to negative, or negative to positive flow of electrons. And our body uses that same principle in a very specific way. Right here in this synaptic gap, we have a little jolt of lightning. Maybe not exactly, we wouldn't maybe see a spark necessarily, but those electric signals are going to flow a lot more quickly through those nerve cells into each other, and eventually onto a specialized cell designed to receive those. So this could be like your muscles. So the synapses, all you need to know about that is a space between nerve cells where the electric impulses jump. Okay, let's break down the parts of the brain. So the 4 main parts of the brain are the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. What you need to know about the frontal lobe is pretty simple. It's where conscious thought occurs. You decide to talk, that comes from your frontal lobe. You decide to move, that comes from your frontal lobe. You decide to think, that comes from your frontal lobe. The temporal lobe. This is where our brains will process speech. Right here next to our ears, we'll receive auditory information, and our brain sifts through it to see if it makes any sense. We'll hear sounds, either from other people or any sounds in general. Our brain has to have categorized it in a way that makes sense. So at one point in your development as a human being, it didn't make sense, and it takes time. Even today, you might find you might hear a sound that makes no sense to you, that is, you are unable to decipher the origin of that sound. If you learn the origin of that sound, you will pack that information away here in your temporal lobe, where then you can access it later if you hear that sound again. When you are a little baby, sound doesn't mean a whole lot. Eventually, you'll learn how to understand what your parents are saying to you as you develop. And then as you grow into a toddler, you might then learn how to structure words and sentences and be able to communicate your feelings and desires. Maybe you're hungry and you've struggled with screaming at your parents for so long that you decide you're going to try to use the language that they've given you. Now, when you grow up with a particular language, you automatically are going to learn that and store that information in your temporal lobe. But if you've ever found, it's a lot more difficult to learn a language when you're older, because right now, then you're going to have to process that new language in your frontal lobe, then go into then force it basically to go into that temporal lobe. You are going to have to purposely try to learn language. So that doesn't happen as easily. One way to make that happen more easily is something called immersion, which is where instead of learning it, you just drop yourself into an area where all you hear is that language and that language only. Eventually, you would learn that language. But since your brain isn't as ready to learn that language as nearly an adult at this point, it's still going to be more of a struggle than it would be if you were a little baby. The occipital lobe, kind of the same thing as the temporal lobe, will just take the visual information that we have, sort it, and figure out if it means anything. And just like a baby, or, not just like a baby, just like the temporal lobe, as a baby, you had to figure out if those images you were seeing, the light going into your eye, meant anything. And for the first week or so, month or so of life, it's not going to mean a whole lot. You're going to see what I was calling a bunch of white noise. It's just static in the background. Nothing makes sense. And if you'll notice with a little baby, they don't focus. It's difficult for them to actually look at anything, because there's so much visual information, they have no place in their brain to put it. But over time, your brain starts to create wrinkles, which are basically pockets of synapses that mean different things. And as you develop, at about 1 month, maybe you'll start to see shadows and shapes. At 2 months, maybe you'll start to recognize the shape of your mother or father. At 3 months, you're probably going to recognize faces. Not all faces, but maybe your parents' faces, maybe close siblings. And then the older you get, the more likely you are to be able to recognize various objects, and then eventually colors. And you, even at this age, 12 and 13, are continually developing these parts of the brain. What it is that you see, hear, feel, think, all of it is still developing until you're an adult. The parietal lobes, our last one, runs background functions and other sensory information. So this would be things like feeling, where it would process the feeling of sharpness or heat. It would process taste. So a lot of these are more automatic, though, than the visual and the auditory sensors in your brain. If you were to experience heat even as a baby, you would find that painful. That's where this would come from. You would find soft things pleasing and hard, rough things unpleasing. That comes from this area. And it's pretty automatic, but is one of our 4 main lobes here. Everything else that you don't control really comes from your hindbrain and spinal cord. So your spinal cord is a big old bundle of nerves that connects to your brain through the hindbrain. Again, that's HINDBRAIN. Your hindbrain, like behind, because it is behind, the main part of your brain. This is the part of your brain that is very similar, like sometimes is referred to as your lizard brain. It's your fight or flight response. It's what controls all of the stuff you can't control. And a lot of creatures who do not have the advanced brains that we have just this part of the brain. Very, very limited to no emotional capacity beyond fear or want. Fear being get away from something that's going to kill me, and wanting food or to reproduce. So in our hindbrain, it connects the upper part of our brain, our 4 lobes, to our spinal cord, which then will go throughout our body, controlling things like digestion and automatic breathing, sweating, anything that we can't directly control. This does it for us. And if any part of this spinal cord is damaged, it will greatly affect, hinder, or completely remove the function of that part. So there are 2 parts of the nervous system I want to teach you. The first and main part you need to know is the central nervous system, as opposed to the not central or the peripheral nervous system. The central part is just your brain and your spinal cord. That's all you got to know. Central nervous system is just a brain and a spinal cord. Everything else is out on the periphery. Peripheral nervous system involves all of these other parts of the nervous system. Nerves that go through every part of the body are not part of your central nervous system. Those other parts will help make up the parasympathetic nervous system. So, in addition to other parts, we do have the sympathetic nervous system, and we do have the peripheral nervous system, the automatic nervous system. I just want to teach you the parasympathetic nervous system, mostly because I think the word is the coolest word, parasympathetic. If you can leave here memorizing that word, that would just be the coolest thing for me. It's just a subsection of the automatic nervous system. This is the network of nerves that helps communicate signals from the cerebellum, that hindbrain, controlling functions like digestion that are automatic. So in comparison to the sympathetic nervous system, which is essentially our fight or flight response, we cannot control our dilated pupils. We cannot control whether or not we're going to breathe automatically, if our heart is going to pump, if our body's going to digest food, or if we're going to create urine or feces. We have to digest food, but we can't do it and shouldn't do it purposefully. If we had to decide to do everything, I think we'd get a little exhausted. And that's all of the bits of the nervous system that you need to know.